Who are they? Brian, her son, raised with nothing but love, and every dollar she ever saved. Courtney, his wife, who smiled to her face and whispered behind her back. Together they made her sleep on the couch, in the house she built, with hands that wiped Brian's tears, paid his tuition, buried her husband, and kept going. They called it temporary. They called her too comfortable. Then they called her a burden. But what they never called her was what she truly was, the owner. Now, they've lost the home, the money, each other. And the woman they tried to erase is the one signing the deed to their downfall. This isn't just payback. It's what happens when silence turns into power, and a forgotten mother reclaims everything. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. I brought them into this house. 30 years later, I wasn't even offered a bed. The suitcase clicked shut like a period on a sentence Margaret never thought she'd have to say. She stood at the edge of the hallway, fingers still curled around the handle. The walls of the house, painted in soft grays and pale whites, felt colder tonight, like they belonged to someone else, and maybe they did. Courtney was already halfway through her explanation, her smile too polite to be real. It's just for the weekend. My mom flew in last minute, and she's got that bad back. You know how flights are for her. Margaret nodded once. She hadn't said anything yet. Brian hovered nearby, eyes flicking between the floor and the thermostat. The couch pulls out, he added, like that made it generous. It's pretty comfortable, you'll be fine. Margaret gave a thin smile. Of course, she said. It's your house. A pause. Then she added, softer. Isn't it? Neither of them answered. Later, when they'd gone back to the kitchen, Courtney pouring wine, Brian opening the fridge like he hadn't just gutted her dignity, Margaret wheeled her small suitcase past the guest room. The door was already closed. The soft hum of Courtney's mother's nasal breathing was audible through the wall. Lavender oil diffused from under the door, mixing with the sharper scent of lemon cleaner and something metallic in the air. Maybe the heater kicking on. The living room was dim. A single lamp glowed in the corner, casting long shadows across the beige couch she had bought herself 5 years ago. She unfolded the blanket. It smelled faintly of bleach and fabric softener, like something prepared for a visitor. Except she wasn't one. She eased down onto the cushions. They sank beneath her like a sigh. The ceiling above her was cracked faintly near the vent. She remembered that crack. She had paid for the repairs twice, but it kept reappearing, like the house didn't want to forget who really built it. This house had been hers once, before Brian married Courtney, before Courtney suggested sweetly that it made so much sense for them all to live together while they saved for something bigger. Before Margaret, a widow of 12 years, agreed to sign the place over, temporarily, just to help with the loan. She never took it back. She hadn't thought she needed to. She laid still on the couch, eyes fixed to that crack like it might open wide and swallow her. 30 years ago, she walked into this house carrying Brian on her hip and 2 jobs in her purse. She had fed this foundation with her hours, with her hands, with the slow erosion of her back. She'd worked night shifts at the hospital and weekends at the care center, putting every dollar into the mortgage because she wanted her son to have a roof he'd never have to fear. And now? Now he offered her the couch, and called it a favor. The laughter from the kitchen was low and easy. Courtney's voice rose in a lilt, sarcastic but affectionate. Margaret couldn't make out the words, only the comfort. That ease of belonging. It had once been hers, now it was theirs. She turned onto her side, tucking the blanket higher, but sleep didn't come. Only thoughts, sharp, jagged thoughts that skated across memory and landed in silence. Somewhere past midnight, just as she felt herself drifting, she heard it. A whisper. Too close to ignore. Courtney's voice. She's getting too comfortable here. Might be time she moved out. A beat. No denial from Brian. Only the click of the fridge closing. Margaret stared at the ceiling. That crack had grown, wider or maybe deeper. She no longer knew which one of them would break first. That night, she hears Courtney whisper, "She's too comfortable here. Might be time she moved out. They said the guest room was for family. I guess I no longer qualified." The couch cushion had a hard lump near the middle. It pressed into Margaret's lower back like a silent accusation. She shifted slightly, trying not to groan, not to let it show, not the ache in her hip, not the chill in her bones, not the heat blooming behind her eyes. From the kitchen, the clatter of plates and silverware sounded too bright for a Sunday morning. Courtney was humming, badly, and something in the way the melody danced just out of tune grated more than usual. Margaret sat up slowly, folding the blanket with care. She placed it neatly at the edge of the couch, smoothed it once with her palm, and took a long breath. This wasn't her home anymore. It was her waiting room. At breakfast, Courtney poured herself oat milk into a tall glass and didn't ask Margaret if she wanted coffee. She didn't need to. Margaret made her own quietly, just one scoop of grounds instead of two, and sipped it in silence at the far edge of the counter. Courtney wrinkled her nose dramatically. "Do you smell that?" She sniffed the air and waved a hand near the trash can. "Something's off. Maybe old food?" Margaret didn't respond. Courtney's eyes drifted toward her cup. "Oh, maybe it's the coffee. Kind of burnt, right?" Brian wandered in barefoot, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Morning." Courtney leaned in to kiss his cheek and added, just loud enough, "We might need to go through the pantry again. Some of the old stuff's starting to smell weird." Margaret took another slow sip. She said nothing. Later that day, as she folded the laundry that no one else touched, Margaret heard Courtney on the phone with her sister. The voice drifted up the stairs like smoke, sneaky and sour. "She's up before 6, just doing things, wiping counters, folding blankets. It's like she doesn't know how to relax. It's exhausting to watch." A pause. "And don't even get me started on the snoring." Another laugh. "She says it's allergies, sure." Margaret stopped folding. A soft pair of Brian's socks dangled from her hands. Snoring. Allergies. Number it was grief, and years of overwork, and a neck that never healed right after 3 decades of patient lifting and midnight shifts in the ER. That night she lay awake again. The couch creaked every time she moved. The blanket was too thin. The ceiling fan hummed just off rhythm. Her back ached. Her pride throbbed. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. She had once imagined retirement as a season of stillness. Peaceful mornings with tea, slow walks to the corner bookstore, maybe a garden of her own. Instead, she was hiding her toothbrush in her purse so it wouldn't be in the way. She closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come. Instead, her mind drifted to 5 years ago. Flashback. The living room had been full of boxes. Laughter. Hope. Brian had said, "Mom, we found the place, but we're short on the down payment. Just a little." Courtney added quickly, "We'll pay you back, of course. It's temporary. You'll be co-listed anyway." Margaret had hesitated. Then she'd written the check. The last big one from her retirement fund. "Anything for your future," she'd said, smiling even though her gut had tightened. She hadn't known it would cost her hers. Now, 5 years later, she was on the couch, while the guest room held someone else's mother. Near midnight, she heard footsteps. Soft ones. Then voices. Muffled, but close. Just around the hallway bend. "Brian, just keep her until the mortgage is paid." Silence. Then a quiet chuckle. Courtney's. Margaret's hands curled into the edge of the blanket, her knuckles white. She didn't cry. She didn't move. But inside, something sank, and something else began to rise. Margaret overhears Brian saying, "Just keep her until the mortgage is paid. Renters get more respect than I did under my own roof." Margaret stood at the open fridge, holding a half-empty carton of milk, eyes scanning the near-empty shelves. No eggs, no bread. A single bruised apple rolled in the drawer like an afterthought. She closed the door slowly, the seal hissing shut. Brian walked in behind her, stretching, scratching his jaw. "Hey, we're gonna need to restock soon. Grocery bill's been pretty steep lately." Margaret turned, her face calm. "I bought everything last week." He shrugged like it didn't count. "Yeah, but it's a house of 3 adults now. Maybe we should just split it going forward. Easier that way." She stared at him. A house of 3 adults, not family, not home, just a split bill. At dinner, Courtney brought it up again, this time with a too-sweet voice and a spreadsheet open on her phone. "I made a little tracker, just to keep things fair," she said, passing the phone to Margaret. "Groceries, toiletries, utilities, the usual stuff." The chart had dates, amounts, color-coded bars. At the bottom, in bold, it read, "Margaret, suggested share, $184.32. Margaret handed it back without a word. Courtney smiled, oblivious or pretending. "I mean, technically you use the hot water too, right?" she joked. "We might as well treat it like a proper roommate situation." Brian chuckled. "Might need to start charging rent if you keep using all the electricity." Margaret's fork paused midway to her mouth. That same fork had stirred soup when Brian was sick for 3 weeks in college. That hand had held his while he cried after his father died. That wrist still clicked sometimes from lifting patients through double shifts, all to pay for the degree that let him sit here and laugh about her as if she were extra. Flashback. The hospital hallway smelled like antiseptic and floor wax. Margaret leaned against the staff room door, sipping instant coffee while glancing at her pay stub. It wasn't enough. Again. She blinked hard, then tightened her ponytail and headed back to the floor. 4 more hours before she could even think of resting. And she had to be up by 6 to drive Brian to his campus orientation. She'd promised him he wouldn't have to worry about student loans. "You focus on school," she'd said. "I'll handle the rest." And she did. She always did. Now, her reward was a spreadsheet. The next morning, she came downstairs to find a yellow sticky note on the fridge. Courtney's handwriting. "Can you grab oat milk and eggs today? You're out." Underlined. "You're out, not we're out." Margaret crumpled the note slowly, methodically, and dropped it in the trash. Later that day, while folding laundry in the corner of the living room, she heard Courtney's voice float in from the kitchen. "God, her stuff is everywhere. I just wiped the counters yesterday and now there's crumbs again." "Seriously?" Brian mumbled something. Courtney continued, louder this time, walking into the living room with a damp rag dangling from her hand. "If you're staying," she said, tossing the rag at Margaret's feet, "you can clean." The cloth hit the floor with a soft slap. Margaret looked down at it, then up at Courtney. Her face didn't change. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't defend herself. But in that stillness, something turned. A line had been crossed. Not by the rag, but by the tone, by the idea that her presence was no longer welcome, but useful, only useful. She rose slowly, deliberately, and walked past the rag without picking it up. Courtney scoffed behind her. Margaret didn't turn back. She just whispered to herself, barely audible, "Noted." Courtney throws a rag at her feet, saying, "If you're staying, you can clean." The moment I stood still was the moment I became their burden. The crumbs stayed on the counter that morning. Margaret saw them, small flakes from Courtney's late-night toast, nestled near the edge of the marble like they were waiting for her hands, but she walked past them. On purpose, she let the spoon sit in the sink, let the towels remain unfolded, let the silence settle like dust across the kitchen tile. She made her tea and sat down in the breakfast nook without touching a thing, and that one decision, not cleaning, echoed through the house like a dropped plate. The first ripple came at 9:12 a.m., when Courtney wandered in wearing yoga pants and that tight, fake casual smile she reserved for conversations she pretended weren't confrontational. She opened the fridge, closed it, opened the pantry, then sighed, loud enough to be performative. Margaret didn't respond. Courtney walked past her, stopped, and turned. "Did you wipe the counters down already?" she asked lightly, too lightly. "No," Margaret said, eyes still on her mug. Courtney blinked. "Oh, okay. I thought maybe you had." Another pause. Then Courtney picked up a dishcloth and began wiping with more force than necessary, muttering something under her breath that Margaret couldn't quite hear, but didn't need to. By 10:30, the tension had grown roots. Margaret stayed seated, reading a book she wasn't really absorbing. Courtney began vacuuming, aggressively, as if the carpet had insulted her. Every pass of the machine came closer to Margaret's chair. Eventually, the vacuum snapped off. "You know," Courtney said, standing in the archway with her hands on her hips, If we're all living here, it would be helpful if we could all pitch in. Margaret didn't look up. I thought I already was. Well, lately it feels like you've checked out, Courtney said with a forced laugh. I mean, if you don't want to be here. I didn't say that, Margaret replied quietly. But you're acting like it, Courtney snapped. You barely help anymore. That was when Brian walked in, still in his worn flannel pajama pants, coffee mug in hand, scratching his neck like he didn't want to be part of this. What's going on? He mumbled. She's upset because I didn't clean, Margaret said before Courtney could spin it. Brian raised an eyebrow. Well, I mean, it's not a big deal. It's just, you've always handled the kitchen, that's all. I've always paid for it too, Margaret said, her tone flat. Courtney folded her arms. Now it's about money? No, Margaret said, finally looking up. Now it's about expectation. The room went quiet. Even the birds outside the kitchen window seemed to stop their song. Brian exhaled, long and slow, then set down his mug with a clink. Mom, he said, you're lucky to even have a roof over your head right now. The words landed like a slap. Margaret didn't flinch, but something behind her eyes shuddered. A door closed. Am I? She asked. Courtney touched Brian's arm, trying to play peacemaker too late. That's not what he meant. But he didn't correct himself, because he had meant it. Margaret stood. She didn't yell, didn't tremble. She simply walked to her room, the couch, technically, and sat down. For the first time, she let herself feel it fully. She had become inconvenient, no longer the woman who built the walls around them, just someone who used the power and water and oxygen, a burden. That evening, the mail sat forgotten on the side table. She sifted through it half-distractedly, bills and flyers she didn't care about, until one envelope caught her eye. Cream-colored, slightly yellowed, postmarked from 2 weeks ago, her old employer's name in the return corner, Wilmington Care and Recovery. Margaret froze. She opened it with careful fingers. Inside was a short letter, typed, but with a handwritten note at the bottom. Dear Margaret, Mrs. Hayward left specific instructions in her will. We've been trying to reach you. Please contact this number at your earliest convenience, and below, in shaky blue ink, you told me once no one remembers the caretakers. Well, I did. Vivian Margaret sat perfectly still. Her fingers gripped the paper just a little tighter. That evening, Margaret finds an envelope from a past employer, postmarked 2 weeks ago. She said she'd never forget what I did for her. Turns out she meant it. Margaret stared at the letter in her hands long after the sun had disappeared from the window. The soft ticking of the wall clock marked time, but inside her chest, everything had paused. Vivian Hayward. That name hadn't passed her lips in years, yet the moment she saw it on the envelope, memory came rushing back like a tide refusing to stay out. The paper was thick, textured, the kind used for wedding invitations and important deaths. She smoothed it flat on the table, careful not to crease it, even though her hands trembled slightly. She read it again, slower this time. Mrs. Hayward left specific instructions in her will. You've been named a recipient of her private trust. Please contact our office for further details. Hollings and Maynard, LLPA handwritten note rested below the formal lines, penned in Vivian's old slanted cursive. You told me once no one remembers the caretakers. Well, I did. Vivian. The kitchen light buzzed overhead. Margaret reached up to turn it off and instead stood in the dark, lit only by the amber glow of the oven clock. Her breath fogged lightly against the window pane. Outside, the street was quiet, the kind of quiet that usually made her feel small. Tonight, it made her feel seen. She remembered Vivian clearly, the sprawling estate in the hills, the rooms that smelled like cedar and French perfume, the antique clocks, the breakfast trays that Margaret would carry upstairs, only to end up sitting beside the bed for hours, not because it was her job, but because Vivian needed someone. They had laughed together, cried together, prayed when the pain got bad, and then one day, during one of Vivian's lucid spells, she said it, out of nowhere, while Margaret was brushing her hair. You're the daughter I never had, and you're the only one who didn't treat me like a chore. Margaret had smiled, thinking it was sweet but temporary. That rich people made dramatic promises all the time. That once the will was read, it would all go to the family who never visited. She never expected to be remembered. Not like this. She dialed the number on the letter. A calm male voice answered on the second ring. "Hollings and Maynard, this is Thomas." She identified herself, her voice low, almost reluctant. Part of her still believed this might be a mistake, but when she gave Vivian's name, the silence on the other end turned sharp, respectful. "Ah, yes, Ms. Green. We've been trying to reach you. Please hold one moment." The line clicked, classical music hummed in her ear, then another voice joined. Crisp, professional, but warmer than she expected. "Ms. Green," the new voice said, "I'm Matthew Hollings, managing partner. You're listed as the sole beneficiary of Mrs. Hayward's sealed personal trust." Margaret blinked. Excuse me? "Vivian Hayward left you everything." Silence. Then a rustle of papers. "She specifically instructed that the trust remains sealed until now. You're to be given full control over its contents, liquid assets, and associated properties. As of today, that amounts to approximately $6.5 million, with no debt or contest." Margaret's throat went dry. She swallowed. Hard. "I don't understand," she whispered. "You were clearly important to her," Hollings said simply. "Most people don't make a nurse their heir. But Mrs. Hayward wasn't most people." Margaret ended the call 20 minutes later with a scheduled meeting, login credentials to a private portal, and more legal instructions than she could process in one night. She stood by the stove, phone still in hand, as a single stunned laugh escaped her lips. 6.5 million. Her knees nearly buckled, not from greed, not from shock, but from relief. For the first time in decades, she wasn't tied to anyone. Not for survival, not for shelter, not for love. Upstairs, the sound of laughter echoed from Brian and Courtney's bedroom. The TV flicked shadows across the stairwell. They didn't know. Not yet. Margaret looked at the envelope on the table again, then down at her reflection in the oven glass. For years, she'd made herself small, invisible, useful. Now, she was something else entirely. The lawyer confirms Margaret is the sole beneficiary of $6.5 million. Margaret is now wealthier than Brian and Courtney combined. Some victories are best enjoyed in secret, at least at first. Margaret didn't sleep that night, not from worry, from peace. A strange, quiet kind of peace, like slipping into a hot bath after standing in cold rain for too long. She lay on the couch, eyes open in the dark, the letter folded neatly beneath her pillow. It hummed like a secret against her skin. Not heavy, not loud, just true. She didn't rush to tell anyone. Not Brian, not Courtney. Certainly not the bank or the neighbors. She didn't need to. Silence had become her strength. The next morning she woke before sunrise, not out of obligation, out of clarity. She poured her coffee slower, let the spoon swirl longer, let the moment breathe. Then she opened her laptop, eyes sharp, movements steady. She searched for two things: a high-end hotel nearby with spa service, lake views, and no children's play area. A discreet financial advisor in town, preferably one who didn't advertise on billboards. Both were booked by 7:30 a.m. By noon, Margaret's posture had changed, not visibly, not enough for someone like Courtney to notice, but her stillness had stopped being passive. Now it was choice. Power. She walked through the kitchen like she belonged to no one. Brian noticed first. He came downstairs rubbing his neck. "Hey, Mom, you okay?" Margaret looked up from her tea. "Perfectly." He tilted his head. "You seem, I don't know, quiet." "I've always been quiet, Brian. You're just hearing it now." He gave a small, confused laugh, but she didn't return it. Just turned the page in her book. At dinner, Courtney brought up a new grocery list. Almond milk, some organic granola, protein bars. "I know you've been picking up a few things, but maybe we can all Venmo each other this time," she said, eyes flicking up from her phone. Margaret gave her a level look. "Of course, just send me an invoice. I'll forward it to someone." Courtney frowned. "Who?" "My accountant." The silence that followed was sharper than any argument they'd ever had. By Friday afternoon, Margaret's bag was packed. Just a weekend bag, linen pants, 2 cardigans, a leather journal, and the soft slippers she never wore at home because the floor was always too cold. As the sun dipped low, she stepped out of the house with a calm breath and didn't look back. The hotel lobby smelled like bergamot and polished stone. A concierge smiled warmly as she approached, greeted her by name, and offered complimentary champagne. Margaret declined. But her smile? It was real. Her suite was on the 11th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows, a white duvet that looked untouched by life. She pulled the curtains open wide and let the golden hour spill in. She didn't turn on the TV. She sat by the window, tea in hand, and watched the city blink alive below her. Saturday passed in slow luxury. A massage at noon, a quiet lunch alone, a meeting with the advisor in a private corner booth of a rooftop bar. He called her Ms. Green with the same tone people once used for her employer, and this time, she was the client. By Sunday morning, Margaret no longer felt like someone's mother, someone's burden, someone's chore. She felt like herself, finally. When she returned late Sunday night, the house was dark. She stepped inside quietly. No one came to greet her. No one asked where she'd been. She moved through the living room in silence, setting her bag down beside the couch, then headed toward the kitchen to put away her tea tin. And that's when she saw it. Courtney, crouched by the side table, her back turned, Margaret's purse in her lap. Zipper open, wallet out, fingers rifling through compartments. Courtney didn't hear her at first. Didn't realize. Until Margaret cleared her throat. The sound was quiet, but it hit like a gunshot. Courtney froze, slowly turned her head, eyes wide, lips parted, caught. She finds Courtney rummaging through her purse. The day I packed my bags, no one noticed. That was the last insult. The zipper on her suitcase slid closed with a whisper. Margaret stood in the stillness of pre-dawn, fully dressed in a soft gray turtleneck and pressed slacks, her coat folded neatly over her arm. The house around her was silent, asleep, oblivious. She moved slowly through the living room, the same room where she had once decorated Christmas trees, wiped spilled juice from the carpet, and rocked Brian to sleep after night terrors. Now it felt foreign, not even cold, just unclaimed. She placed a folded note on the coffee table. Not a letter, just a sentence. Out for the weekend. Don't wait up. She didn't owe them more. Not anymore. Outside, the sky was still navy. The cab's headlights flickered across the lawn, casting long, sharp shadows of the bare trees. As the car pulled away from the curb, Margaret didn't look back. There was nothing behind her worth remembering, not in its current form. Not until she could take it back. Not until it was hers again. The hotel was nestled in the hills, a 5-star retreat with velvet curtains, attentive silence, and soft jazz echoing through marble halls. She stepped through the glass doors like she belonged there, because now she did. The concierge smiled as he took her bag. "Welcome back, Ms. Green." "Thank you," she said simply. She checked into her corner suite, set her phone on silent, and stared out over the city from the 17th floor. Cars moved like ants. People buzzed through their lives. But up here, it was still. Later that afternoon, she met her lawyer in a private lounge on the hotel's mezzanine level. Margaret sipped espresso while reviewing the documents spread before her like puzzle pieces, each one a quiet step toward liberation. "So the LLC is fully registered," her lawyer explained. "We can begin acquisitions immediately. No names tied back to you. The entity will appear as a first-time investor." "Good," she said, eyes unmoving. "Start with the house." He raised a brow. "The Bellcrest property?" She nodded. "Yes, that one first." "Understood." He slid the papers forward for her to sign. Margaret picked up the pen, the weight of it grounding her, and wrote her name, not like a woman giving permission, but like one reclaiming territory. By the next morning, the LLC had submitted its first formal inquiry on the house. No one, not Brian, not Courtney, knew they were now being watched, evaluated, calculated. They didn't know the very walls they leaned on were being bought back piece by piece. Margaret kept to herself, floating between the hotel spa and rooftop terrace, journaling between meetings and silent cups of tea. Her silence had evolved into strategy. Her stillness had become an act of war. On the third morning, while scrolling through a real estate analytics dashboard provided by her lawyer's office, a new red flag appeared on the screen. She tapped it twice, zooming in. Bellcrest Residence. Property alert, second mortgage filed, 3 weeks ago. Her breath caught, not from surprise, but from something darker. Brian had refinanced the house, without telling her, without telling anyone. He'd leveraged what little was left of the equity, her equity. It was likely under his name now, or both his and Courtney's. And if he defaulted, the bank wouldn't go to them. It would go to whoever now owned the debt. She leaned back slowly, the air conditioning brushing against her skin like a warning. The house she built with decades of sacrifice, night shifts, skipped vacations, and empty birthdays. It was being drained to fund whatever they couldn't afford. Credit cards, Courtney's gym membership, Brian's business investments. And now, the mortgage wasn't just a roof. It was a weapon. Margaret stared at the screen, then closed the laptop. She poured herself a glass of chilled water, took a long, thoughtful sip, and whispered aloud into the quiet of the room. "They don't even know I'm coming." She finds out Brian put the house under a second mortgage. The house I built became the one thing dragging them underwater. Brian sat at the dining table with 3 envelopes spread out like playing cards. None of them were good. One was a late notice from the bank. One was a credit card statement with a minimum due that could have covered rent in a smaller city. And the third, he hadn't opened yet. Courtney stood across from him, arms crossed, face pale despite the morning sunlight streaming through the kitchen window. Her mascara was still smudged from yesterday. Her phone lay face down on the table, silenced for the first time in years. "They froze the company account," Brian muttered. Courtney blinked. "What?" "They froze it. All our pending invoices. Nothing's clearing." He looked up at her slowly. "It's over." Brian's company, a modest marketing startup, had limped through the last 6 months on bluff, bounced checks, and borrowed time. Clients stopped responding. His business partner had gone radio silent. Payroll missed twice. He used Margaret's second mortgage funds to buy time, but the time ran out. Courtney wasn't faring better. The yoga studio she managed closed unexpectedly. Budget cuts, ownership change. "We'll keep you in mind for freelance. Translation, you're out." By the end of the week, the fridge was filled with expired hummus and a carton of milk that smelled wrong. They stopped heating the house at night. Courtney canceled her manicure appointment without explanation and told her sister they were focusing on savings. They started buying generic brands, then stopped buying altogether, and still neither of them called Margaret. Because pride, even while sinking, refused to scream for a lifeline. They were sure she'd come back. She always had. She always would, right? But while they drowned in silence, Margaret moved like a shadow behind their walls. Her shell company, Silver Briar Holdings, LLC, filed the notice of default through the bank's investment division. No fanfare, no warning. Just a quiet shift in ownership, like the ground giving way beneath their feet. Her lawyer handled the filings. Margaret simply signed her name. Once. The notice of intent to foreclose arrived on a Thursday. Brian found it in the mailbox, wedged between a pizza coupon and a catalog they couldn't afford to order from. At first, he thought it was a mistake. His name was on the envelope, but the sender's address was unfamiliar. He opened it slowly. Courtney watched from the hallway. "What is it?" she asked. Brian didn't answer. She stepped closer. "Brian?" He turned the letter toward her. The heading in bold, black letters, "Intent to foreclose, notice of default and debt collection." Courtney's breath hitched. This has to be wrong." "It's not," he said numbly. "We're 90 days behind." But your mom, she'd never let it get this far." "She doesn't know," Brian said automatically, but his voice lacked conviction. Courtney's silence said what neither wanted to admit. She did know. And she hadn't stopped it. In the following days, they called the mortgage lender, left messages, sent emails, got polite replies from lawyers who referred them back to the shell company. The shell company had no phone number, no website, just a mailing address in a business park 3 cities over. Brian drove there. It was a gray glass building with mirrored windows and a receptionist who wouldn't give names. "No one takes meetings here," she said with a tight smile. "You'll need to go through the legal contact." She handed him a card. When he read the law firm's name, Hollings and Maynard, his stomach dropped. The same firm from the letter Margaret had received, the one he never asked about. He tucked the card into his wallet, face blank. Courtney noticed. "What?" But he shook his head. "Nothing?" Because suddenly, he wasn't sure. Not about the company, not about the house, and definitely not about who was pulling the strings. That night, a fresh email arrived in Brian's inbox. Final opportunity to cure outstanding balance. $17,460.88 due within 14 business days. He stared at the screen, clicked reply, hovered over the keyboard, but typed nothing. Because deep down, some part of him already knew it was her. Brian receives an intent to foreclose letter, but doesn't know the source. "They thought I'd come back when they snapped. I didn't even flinch." The first call came at 7:12 a.m. Margaret saw the name flash across the hotel phone's screen. Brian, home, before it buzzed once and stopped. No voicemail, no follow-up. The second call came 6 minutes later, then a third. By noon, there were 14 missed calls, 4 texts, 1 email titled, "Please just call me." She read none of them. She didn't need to. She sat by the floor-to-ceiling window of her suite, wrapped in her oatmeal-colored shawl, sipping chamomile tea. Below, the city pulsed with quiet industry, people hurrying to jobs, trains humming past intersections, a food truck lining up at the curb. Margaret didn't move. Her phone vibrated again. She turned it face down on the table. Across from her, her lawyer sipped his espresso and gave a small nod. The lender completed the filing. The foreclosure will be public record by Friday. She didn't smile, didn't blink, only said, "Good." By the second day, Brian's texts had shifted tone. "Mom, what's going on? We're getting legal notices. Is this you? Did you do something?" By the third, they turned sharp. "You're not even returning my calls. This is cruel. You owe us at least a conversation." Margaret opened each message. Let the read receipts mark their presence. But she said nothing. Courtney's voice note came next. It was 4 minutes long. Margaret didn't play it right away. She sat at her vanity in the hotel suite, brushing her silver-streaked hair, watching herself in the mirror. The reflection didn't tremble. Her hands didn't shake. Then, slowly, she pressed play. Courtney's voice exploded into the room, tight with anger disguised as pain. "I don't even know who you are anymore. You used to be grateful. You used to care about family. We opened our home to you, and this is what you do? Behind our backs? Are you seriously trying to ruin us? You're not a victim, Margaret. You're vindictive, and I hope you enjoy that little hotel while we lose everything." Margaret paused the message halfway through. She'd heard enough. She opened her laptop and logged into her client dashboard. Her attorney had sent through fresh updates, screenshots of the court filings, asset freeze notices on Brian's accounts, a flagged alert about their delinquent credit cards. She clicked through them slowly. Not with malice, with clarity. They had built their comfort on her exhaustion. Now they would feel what it was like to live without it. By the 4th day, she turned off notifications entirely. Her world shrank to the size of the hotel suite, her journal, her tea, and the morning news. There was no rage in her anymore, no need for speeches, just silence that stretched like a mirror and let them see themselves in it. Then came the knock. It was soft, polite. Margaret glanced at the clock. 8:02 p.m. She wasn't expecting room service. She walked slowly to the door, heels tapping softly on the hardwood floor, her robe tied neatly around her waist. She opened it. Courtney stood on the threshold, makeup smeared, jaw tight, arms wrapped across her chest like a barrier against the cold, or the truth. Margaret said nothing. Courtney blinked. "Can we talk?" Margaret tilted her head slightly, then looked down at the name tag pinned to Courtney's oversized coat. No hotel logo, just her own name. She hadn't come for peace. She'd come for leverage. Margaret looked her up and down once, slowly. Then, without a word, she stepped back, but not to invite her in, just far enough to close the door. Courtney appears at Margaret's hotel uninvited. She came in like a storm, forgetting it was my sky she stood under. The elevator dinged. Margaret stood in the marble-tiled lobby of the Arliss Grand, the muted clink of china from the cafe behind her and the scent of bergamot candles drifting through the air. She had just finished her morning meeting with a luxury realtor, the brochures for 3 lakefront properties tucked neatly into her leather tote. She adjusted her scarf, calm, silent, until chaos broke through the entrance doors like a crack in glass. "Margaret?" Courtney's voice, frantic, loud, not caring who was listening. Heads turned. Margaret froze for only a moment before turning around with practiced grace. There she was. Courtney stormed across the lobby in a half-buttoned coat, her hair tangled, face blotchy from tears or lack of sleep, or both. Her heels clicked erratically across the polished floor. Margaret did not move. Courtney's eyes were wild. "You're just gonna ignore us? Ruin our lives and then hide in some overpriced hotel suite like nothing happened?" A hush fell over the lobby. Margaret gave the briefest glance to the concierge. He nodded discreetly and lifted the receiver to call security. "Courtney," Margaret said quietly, "lower your voice." "You don't get to tell me anything anymore." Courtney's voice cracked. "You're cruel. You're selfish. You played house with us and then pulled the rug like we were some strangers." Margaret's expression didn't shift. Her voice was cool, measured. "No, Courtney, you played house. I simply moved out of the game." Courtney scoffed. "You want to feel powerful? Congratulations, you're rich and alone." "Better than being broke and pretending," Margaret said. A gasp rippled through the onlookers. Security arrived, 2 suited men moving with quiet authority. "Ma'am," one of them said to Courtney, "you're creating a disturbance. We're going to have to ask you to leave." "I'm talking to my mother-in-law," she snapped. "This is a family matter." The taller guard shook his head. "Not in this hotel, it's not." Courtney turned to Margaret, her voice dropping into something hoarse and exhausted. "Please, we're losing everything. Brian's falling apart. We need you. You can fix this. You always fix it. Just, please." Margaret inhaled slowly. Her gaze softened, but her spine stayed straight. "I already did," she said. And then she stepped aside. The guards flanked Courtney gently, but firmly. She resisted at first. Then, seeing no audience left willing to watch her break, she let them guide her back to the revolving doors. Her final words echoed faintly as she left. "You don't know what you've started." Margaret didn't reply. Because she did. Later that day, Margaret toured the last home on her list, a private, gated property nestled in a tree-lined cul-de-sac. Wraparound porch, lake view, garden already blooming with daffodils. The realtor walked her through the sunroom. "It's a clean deal," he said. "Previous owner wanted out fast. All cash, discreet transfer. You'll have privacy, peace." Margaret smiled. "That's all I want." They signed the initial paperwork on site. It was hers. The next morning, Margaret returned to the house for a final walkthrough. The air smelled like fresh paint and lemon oil. She wandered barefoot across the wood floors, letting her fingertips trail. Across the windowsills, a soft knock came at the door. It wasn't a contractor. It was a woman, late 30s, short auburn bob, designer sunglasses perched on her head. She smiled politely. "Hi, I'm Amanda. I live next door." Margaret stepped out onto the porch. "Nice to meet you." Amanda glanced toward the house Margaret had just purchased. Her smile faded. "You bought Courtney's old place, didn't you?" Margaret tilted her head. "You know her?" Amanda's laugh was dry. "She's my sister." A pause, then she added more quietly, "And I warned the last owner not to rent to her." Margaret's eyebrows rose. "She claimed she co-owned this house," Amanda went on. "She never did. It was mine. I just wanted out." Margaret exhaled, slow and full. "Thank you," she said, voice soft but firm, "for letting go of it." Amanda smiled again, smaller this time. "You planning to stay long?" Margaret looked over the porch, the trees, the lake beyond the fence. "Yes," she said, "this time I'm staying for good." Her new neighbor turns out to be Courtney's estranged sister. The house Brian lives in was originally owned by Courtney's sister. Margaret just bought it from her. "This time I didn't need help carrying my things. I carried myself." The sky was the kind of pale blue that looked hand-painted, dappled with wisps of cloud drifting lazily above the lake. Margaret stood at the edge of her new porch, hands on her hips, watching the moving van reverse slowly into the gravel driveway. No one helped her pack, no one offered to carry boxes. No one hovered awkwardly behind her, asking, "Are you sure you're okay?" And for the first time in years, she was. She felt the stillness of the trees, the subtle lapping of the water beyond the property line, and the hush of a new beginning sliding gently into place. Inside, the house was blank and bright, empty but not hollow. The floors gleamed from the recent polish, and her bare footsteps made soft thuds against the smooth wood. She had already chosen where the easel would go, in the sunroom, where golden light fell like honey through the glass. The movers brought in the last of her boxes, labeled simply in her own handwriting: kitchen, bedroom, studio. No clutter, no chaos. Just Margaret and the version of herself she had buried under decades of obligation. By afternoon, her new sofa was in place, warm beige fabric, deep cushions, pillows she had picked out just because they made her smile. She brewed a fresh pot of tea in her glass kettle, the scent of chamomile and citrus filling the air. The sound of the kettle clicking off was somehow louder than it had been at Brian's house. Maybe because it was the first time she actually heard it without background noise, passive aggression, or expectation. She poured the tea, then walked barefoot onto the porch. No one asked her to turn the kettle off. No one told her to lower her voice. No one whispered that she was too comfortable. She sipped and exhaled. Later that evening, Margaret unpacked a canvas that had been gathering dust for nearly 7 years. It was half-finished, an abstract burst of blue and copper, soft curves interrupted by sharp, rising lines. She set it on the easel and stared at it, then reached for the brush. Her hands weren't as steady as they once were, but they didn't shake. Instead, they moved slowly, confidently, as if every stroke was part of a story only she was allowed to tell now. The brush whispered against the canvas. Color bloomed where silence used to live. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the lake when the phone rang. Margaret glanced at the screen. Brian. Her thumb hovered over the screen. She didn't press decline, didn't press answer either. The call ended on its own. Then came the voicemail notification. She let it sit for a moment, unfinished tea in one hand, brush still resting in the other. Then curiosity, or perhaps compassion, nudged her. She pressed play. Brian's voice was different, frayed. "Hey, Mom, I don't even know if you'll listen to this. I'm not even sure what to say. I was stupid. I didn't see what you were holding. I didn't know how much you were hurting. Courtney's gone. She moved out last night. Said she can't take the tension anymore. The house is falling apart, literally and figuratively. Everything's a mess, and I miss you. Not because we need you, because you're my mother. Just, please, talk to me once, just once." The message ended in silence. Margaret stood in it, not broken, not softened, just still. She looked back at the canvas, the rising copper line nearly complete. Brian leaves a voicemail, teary, begging for a second chance. "Once I slept on a bench because of him. Now I sit on one in peace." The air was crisp, the kind that pinched the tips of your fingers even through wool-lined gloves. Leaves rustled along the walking path as Margaret stepped off the sidewalk and made her way into the park, the rhythm of her boots muffled by soft gravel. She hadn't been back here in over a year, not since that night, not since she sat here under a sky that didn't care, with a spine curved from exhaustion and a suitcase tucked close like a shield. Today, she wore a charcoal wool coat, double-breasted, collar turned up. Her silver hair was tucked neatly into a low bun beneath a soft gray beret. She looked like someone visiting a memory, not escaping into one. The bench was still there, same weathered wood, same squeaky left armrest, same paint-chipped plaque that read, "In memory of James Tucker, 1942 to 2010. She ran her gloved hand across the surface before lowering herself onto it, easing into the chilled seat like it was a place earned, not taken. The wind whispered through the trees. Children played in the distance. Somewhere a dog barked and an old couple laughed softly by the fountain. But here, in this small patch of stillness, Margaret sat with her past, without letting it sit on her. Flashback. It had been raining that night, not a storm. Just that annoying, steady drizzle that soaked everything slowly and left you shivering before you realized you were wet. Margaret had stood on the same path, a wheeled suitcase in one hand, her coat barely shielding her from the cold. She had nowhere to go. Not after the argument. Not after Brian's final words. Maybe you should figure things out on your own for a bit. So she did. She found the bench, curled into herself beneath her coat, and waited for the ache in her legs and back to quiet down. But it never did. Neither did the ache in her heart. She remembered trying to sleep, but being too aware of everything, how loud the wind was, how exposed her body felt, how humiliating it was that after all the years, all the sacrifices, all the silence she swallowed, this was how it ended. Now she sat in the same place, warm, full, unshaken, not the same woman, not even close. A jogger passed her by, a man in his 60s with earbuds in and a windbreaker zipped to his chin. He paused as he noticed her sitting so still. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked kindly, removing one earbud. Margaret smiled, not the forced kind she used to wear like armor, but the easy kind that came from within. "I'm better than I've ever been." The man nodded. "All right then," and jogged on. Margaret watched him disappear around the path. She exhaled. It wasn't just a sigh, it was a release. She stayed a while longer, watching the sun make its slow descent behind the trees. Gold filtered through the branches, painting the grass in honey and flame. She thought about the houses she now owned, the one she lived in, the one she bought from under their feet, and the one she would never give back. She thought about silence, how it used to be her punishment. Now, it was her prize. When the sky turned soft pink and shadows grew long, she rose slowly, brushing her coat off and adjusting her scarf. Her phone buzzed in her pocket as she crossed the park's edge, the sound barely noticeable at first. By the time she reached her car, the screen was glowing with notifications. 10 missed calls, 3 new messages, 1 live stream alert. Her brows furrowed. She opened the app, and there it was, Brian's face, red-eyed and blotchy, on live stream, broadcasting to hundreds of viewers. The caption read, "My mother abandoned me. The truth about Margaret Green." The video had already been shared 128 times. The chat was a storm of sympathy. Margaret didn't click play. She didn't need to hear it to know the sound of desperation. She sat in the driver's seat, locked the doors, and stared out at the lake in the distance. No tears, no shaking. Just a quiet breath, then a whisper to herself. He's still trying to spin a story he never owned. She returns to her villa, checks her phone, and sees Brian is live online with a sob story titled, "My mother abandoned me." He cried for sympathy, but I had receipts. By morning, the video had crossed 50,000 views. Brian's face was frozen mid-sob in the thumbnail, red-eyed, raw-voiced, looking every bit the grieving son the internet wanted to believe. His voice quivered as he spoke into his camera, framed by the peeling paint of the living room Margaret once paid to remodel. "She walked out without warning," he said, "left us drowning in bills, just disappeared. And now, she's hiding out in a luxury villa like we meant nothing. She used us," he added, lower now. "I gave her everything, a home, a family, and all she did was wait until we were vulnerable enough to burn." The comments came in like a flood. "How could a mother do this? She sounds heartless. Praying for you, Brian. Stay strong. You deserve better. And worse, you should sue her. She needs to be exposed. Let's get him some help, y'all. Venmo's in bio. Margaret sat at her breakfast nook, tablet in hand, a fresh cup of Earl Grey beside her, steam rising like incense. She watched the video, not with anger, not with sadness, with precision. She gave it 12 hours, enough time for the internet to bask in their fury, enough time for the donations to climb past $3,000, enough time for his performance to tighten its grip on public sympathy. Then, at exactly 9:02 p.m., Margaret opened her own account. No bio, no filters, just a plain gray background behind her and a single sentence in the title, "The Other Side of the Story, A Mother's Silence Ends." She adjusted the webcam and hit Go Live. The room was quiet. Her voice wasn't. "Good evening," she began, tone level, eyes steady. "My name is Margaret Green. I am Brian's mother." The chat began to fill, at first with skepticism, some with open hostility. But she continued, "I've stayed silent out of respect, but lies should never travel farther than truth." She reached beside her for a folder and held up the first document, zoomed in with steady fingers. Adoption papers. Brian wasn't her biological son. He was taken in when she was 27, raised like her own, loved like her own, chosen. The chat slowed. She moved on. "Here are bank transfers totaling $117,000 deposited into Brian's account over the last 5 years. Click, click. Screenshots shared in real time. A pause, a breath. Then came the recordings. She hit play on the voicemail. Brian's voice, clear and cruel. "She's like an ATM that finally ran dry. About time we start thinking about flipping that house." The chat exploded. Some still defended him. Most didn't. Then the final nail. A video, barely 20 seconds long, recorded months earlier. Brian laughing with Courtney. "She's too comfortable here. Maybe we do start pushing her out." Margaret didn't smile. She simply said, "This is what silence buys you. Manipulation, performances, and when that fails, publicity." She ended the stream after 15 minutes. No plea for sympathy, no request for donations, no bio link. Just the truth. Raw. Undeniable. By midnight, Brian's video was flagged for misinformation. His Venmo link reported. Commenters flipped on him like wolves, sensing weakness. "Wait, he lied? Yo, that voicemail? I'm sick. How do you twist this on your own mother? I donated, I want it back." Someone uploaded a reaction video titled, "We Got Played. The Truth About Brian Green." The next morning, Margaret received a call. Unknown number. She let it ring. Then came a voicemail. "Hi, Ms. Green. My name is Elise Harper. I'm a journalist with The Fold, and we're working on a piece called Mothers Who Disappear, profiling women who step away from toxic family dynamics. I watched your stream. Would love to talk." Margaret saved the message, then opened her laptop. 20 minutes into the Zoom interview, Elise leaned forward, eyes sharp behind her glasses. "You may already know this," she said, "but our team did a deeper dive into the title records of the Green properties, and we found something interesting." Margaret raised a brow. "You were listed as co-owner on not one, but 3 of the houses Brian and Courtney claimed as theirs." A pause. Elise added, "Did you know that?" Margaret leaned back in her chair, slow and composed. "I do now." A journalist uncovers that Margaret was secretly listed as co-owner of 2 more properties Brian and Courtney claimed were theirs. The empire they built wasn't just crumbling, it was never fully theirs. "The empire they built on my back had no foundation of its own." The headline broke before sunrise. Courtroom collapse. Brian Green's wife files for divorce after financial scandal goes public. It spread like wildfire. Courtney, makeup-free, shoulders squared, hair pulled into a severe bun, stood on the courthouse steps in a beige trench coat and delivered a practiced, brittle statement. "I was unaware of the extent of the mismanagement. I trusted my husband, and I deeply regret that trust." The press swarmed her. She played the role of the betrayed spouse perfectly. She never mentioned Margaret. Not once. Because she knew better now. By noon, the bank had frozen the last of Brian's accounts. The video fallout had sparked a deeper audit. Donation platforms returned funds. Clients withdrew from his consulting business. The IRS opened an inquiry, and with Margaret now publicly connected to the deed records of the family properties, the story gained national traction. Woman wronged by son quietly co-owned their assets all along. A mortgage blogger picked it up, then a news aggregator, then a TikTok lawyer who called it the quietest revenge arc of the decade. Margaret didn't comment. She didn't need to. Instead, she focused on the second property, a small duplex on the east side of town, unassuming from the curb, but steady. It had been bought under Brian's LLC 5 years earlier, but the deed history showed Margaret's name in faded ink. Margaret Elaine Green, co-purchaser and lien guarantor. She hadn't seen it in years, had almost forgotten, but the title company hadn't. The moment her name resurfaced in media records, they contacted her. The legal process was smooth, clean, and when the transfer was complete, Margaret didn't hesitate. She didn't move in, didn't renovate, didn't hold on. Instead, she signed it over to the Willow Haven Shelter for Women and Children, anonymously, under her maiden name, Margaret Elaine Thomas. No press, no ribbon-cutting ceremony, just keys handed quietly to the director and a soft thank you whispered in a sunlit lobby. That evening, she stood across the street from the duplex as volunteers moved supplies in. A little girl waved to her through the window, then ran back to her mother. Margaret turned away before anyone could recognize her. Her work here was done. That night, rain tapped gently against her windows at the villa. She curled into her chair by the fireplace, mug of cinnamon tea in hand, wrapped in the same knit blanket she'd once kept folded on the end of Brian's couch. Her phone buzzed softly against the table. No caller ID. Voicemail received. She didn't check it right away. Instead, she stared at the fire, letting the warmth settle into her spine, letting the quiet remind her that peace isn't loud, it's chosen. Only when the flames began to dip did she pick up the phone. The voicemail was short. I don't even know where to start. The voice was unmistakable. You don't have to listen, you probably won't, but I had to try. A pause. Then, I saw the shelter. The name on the paperwork. I know it was you. Another silence. The kind that fills a room. I'm sorry, for all of it. I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm still your son. Click. No name left. But the envelope came the next day, handwritten, plain, no return address. Inside, a single folded letter. Signed simply, Brian. Margaret receives a handwritten letter with no return address. It's signed, Brian. They made me sleep on the couch. Now I own the floor beneath their feet. The letter sat unopened on Margaret's writing desk for 3 days. It was wrinkled along the edges, the paper creased like it had been gripped too tightly, then smoothed with regret. No envelope, no return address, just one name at the end. Brian. She hadn't touched it, not yet. Instead, she moved through her days with practiced grace. Morning tea by the window, a stroll through the garden, paint drying in soft streaks on her easel. Her home was filled with silence, but not the kind that empties, the kind that soothes. On the 4th morning, just before sunrise, she finally opened it. It was 4 pages long, blue ink, slanted writing, a rambling mix of confession and plea. I'm sorry I didn't see what you were carrying. I didn't realize how much you gave up until everything collapsed. Courtney's gone. The house is gone. I'm broke, alone, and I miss my mom. There was no ask for money, no mention of the foreclosure, no rage this time, just desperation, and a line that made her pause. I see you in my dreams now, walking through the hallway like a ghost. I think I was the one who disappeared, not you. Margaret stared at that sentence for a while, the ink rippling faintly in the morning light. Then she folded the letter once, set it in the drawer of her desk, and never opened it again. By noon, she was downtown, fountain pen in hand, seated at a mahogany conference table in a private legal office. Across from her sat a smiling woman from the Haven Mothers Foundation, a nonprofit that offered housing grants, daycare stipends, and counseling for single mothers trying to restart their lives. Margaret didn't speak much. She let the money do the talking. $250,000, signed, sealed, quiet, no press release, No announcement, just a quiet wire transfer and one small note included in the donation record in honor of those who raised quietly and gave everything. M.E. Thomas. That evening, Margaret curled up by the fireplace, tea steeping beside her, the room cast in amber shadows from the flickering flame. Outside, 2 bluebirds danced near the balcony railing, darting back and forth, chirping in staccato bursts like they were debating something urgent and silly. She smiled, resting her journal on her knees, opened to a fresh page, began to write. Closure doesn't come with an apology, it comes with peace. It comes when the voices that hurt you go quiet and you stop waiting to be heard. It comes when you finally remember your worth doesn't live in anyone else's house. You are not their floor. You are your own foundation. Somewhere in the city, Brian sat in a borrowed apartment. His name trended online for all the wrong reasons. His inbox was quiet. His phone, silent. His legacy, unraveled. He checked the mailbox each morning, hoping for a letter, but nothing ever came, because Margaret wasn't writing to the past anymore. She was living. That night, as rain tapped gently on the balcony glass, Margaret stood barefoot in the center of her living room. The hardwood was warm beneath her feet, the rug plush, the lighting soft. She looked around at everything, the velvet couch, the oil painting above the mantel. The flicker of fire reflected in the glass of the cabinet doors. She turned slowly, letting the moment sink in. No noise, no tension, no one asking her to move, clean, contribute, or shrink. Just stillness and space and power. She whispered into the silence, almost amused. They stole my comfort once. She walked to the window, pulled the curtain back, and watched as lightning rolled across the lake. Then she smiled. Now I live in it. They stole my comfort once. Now I live in it.